My name is Cheryl J. Brown. I'm 29 years old, and at the time this story begins, I had been in a relationship with my boyfriend, Daniel Mercer, for a little over 3 years. We had lived together for one of those years. On paper, it looked stable. Good jobs, shared rent, weekend routines, the kind of relationship people assume is slowly moving toward an engagement. Daniel worked in luxury retail management. Presentation was everything to him. Clothes, restaurants, the car someone drove, the watch they wore, the way things photographed on social media. Image was currency in his world. Early in our relationship, I mistook that for confidence. Later, I realized it was judgment wearing polished shoes. Daniel had a habit of correcting servers in restaurants, returning gifts in front of people if they didn't meet his standards, making casual comments about how certain things looked aspirational, which was his polite way of saying they weren't good enough. The comments came slowly at first, about my car being temporary, about how certain watches suggested you were still climbing, about how some of his friends' girlfriends had partners who were already established. He never yelled. He never demanded. He just smiled and said things that landed a half second too late, the kind of remarks where you don't realize you've been insulted until you're already apologizing. Around our third anniversary, I started thinking seriously about proposing. Not impulsively, methodically. I made spreadsheets for budgets, quiet savings goals, late-night research about jewelers. I wasn't rich, but I was responsible, and I believed if you were going to ask someone to spend their life with you, it should feel thoughtful. I found a small jeweler who talked more about craftsmanship than carats, the kind of place where the ring mattered because of the work behind it, not the price tag attached to it. One night I floated the idea to Daniel. Nothing dramatic, just a soft, someday conversation while we were sitting on the couch. He laughed. Not cruelly. Worse. Amused. "Don't," he said, still looking at his phone. "Don't what?" I asked. "Don't propose," he replied casually. "My friends would absolutely mock the ring you could afford." Then he looked up at me like he was doing me a favor by being honest. "They're brutal," he added. "I'd never hear the end of it." I waited for the rest of the sentence. Something reassuring. Something like, "But I don't care." It never came. That was the first night I realized something important was being negotiated without my consent. I didn't argue with him. That surprised him. He kept scrolling through his phone, clearly expecting me to push back, to reassure him, to promise I would somehow level up. When I stayed quiet, he glanced over with the irritated expression he always wore when I didn't follow the script he expected. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm just being realistic." "I know," I replied, and that seemed to bother him more than if I had gotten defensive. Over the next few weeks, the subject came up again. Never directly. Always sideways. We'd go to dinner with his friends, and I'd hear it in the subtext. Conversations about standards, about rings that photographed well, about one friend who did it right with a ring that actually impressed people. Daniel would laugh a little too loudly during those conversations, then glance at me, making sure I heard it. I heard it. He started sending me screenshots from social media, influencers showing engagement rings, articles titled things like, "What Your Ring Says About Your Worth." Once he forwarded me a post with the caption, "This is the minimum." I asked him carefully if the ring mattered more than the marriage. He scoffed. "Why do women always say that? It's not either or. It's about effort." Effort apparently had a price tag. A few months later, he asked if I was still thinking about proposing. "I am," I said. "Good," he replied. "Just don't embarrass me." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was loud, because it was honest. I started saving anyway. But something inside me had already shifted. Every time I looked at rings after that, I heard his voice. Not excitement. Anticipation of judgment. And slowly, quietly, I stopped imagining a proposal. Once I stopped planning the proposal, something unexpected happened. The relationship didn't explode. There were no dramatic arguments, no slammed doors, no declarations about the future. Instead, everything simply became clearer. Without the quiet pressure of preparing for an engagement, I started noticing things I had previously explained away. Daniel compared our life to other people's constantly. Restaurants were ranked. Trips were evaluated by how impressive they looked in photos. Purchases were measured by whether they kept up with someone else's highlight reel. I realized that in 3 years together, he had rarely asked what I actually wanted our future to look like. What mattered was how it would appear. He noticed the shift in me, too. "You don't talk about the future anymore," he said one night while we were brushing our teeth. His tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory. "I do," I replied, "just not out loud." He frowned at my reflection in the mirror. "That's not cute." A few weeks later, he invited me to brunch with some of his coworkers. I'd met them before, quick introductions at office events. This time, the conversation lasted longer. There was a man there named Marcus Hale, early 30s, calm voice, the kind of person who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. We ended up talking about work most of the meal. We were in the same industry, but different sides of it, which made the conversation surprisingly easy. Daniel noticed. On the drive home, he was quiet for several minutes before finally speaking. "You were flirting." I was talking. Well, don't, he snapped. "It's embarrassing." That word again. Embarrassing. Like everything in our relationship existed on a stage, and my role was to make sure the performance never slipped. Over the next few months, the relationship coasted in a strange middle space. There were no major fights. There also wasn't much affection. Daniel continued dropping hints about timelines, wedding invitations we should attend, venues he liked, rings he accidentally showed me online. I nodded, made non-committal noises. He interpreted that as progress. Meanwhile, my own life was shifting in ways he didn't really notice. I received a promotion at work. It wasn't flashy, but it meant stability, better pay, more responsibility. I told him about it over dinner one night. He smiled briefly. "Good," he said. "That helps." Helps what? I wondered. Around that same time, Daniel started mentioning his coworkers more often. Office drama, promotions, who was dating whom. Marcus's name came up occasionally. "He's nice," Daniel said once with a shrug. "A little plain, but competent." Plain? I didn't correct him. I was starting to understand something important. Daniel didn't really want a partner. He wanted an accessory, someone who looked impressive standing next to him in photos. And I was quietly becoming someone who no longer needed his approval. The funny thing is, I still hadn't decided to leave. I was just waiting for the moment when staying would feel more dishonest than walking away. That moment came on a Tuesday night, which somehow felt fitting. Nothing dramatic ever happened with Daniel on weekends. Those were reserved for brunches and appearances. Tuesdays were when the real conversations slipped out by accident. He came home late, dropped his bag by the door, and announced he had run into an old college friend who had just gotten engaged. 3-carat oval, he said while kicking off his shoes. Custom setting. You should have seen it. I nodded without looking up from my laptop. He noticed immediately. "Why do you act like this doesn't matter?" he asked. "It's like you're checked out." I closed the laptop and looked at him. "Because you told me not to propose." He blinked. "That's not what I said." "It is," I replied calmly. "You said your friends would mock the ring I could afford." He waved a hand dismissively. "I was being practical. I was saving you from embarrassment." "Mine?" He sighed dramatically. "Why are you holding on to that? I thought you understood." That word again. Understood. As if swallowing the insult was the correct response. "So what's the plan?" I asked. "Wait until I meet a price point you approve of?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said the sentence that ended everything. "I just want to be proud of what I'm wearing. Not proud of us. Not excited about marrying me. Proud of the object." Something in me finally settled. "I'm not proposing," I said calmly. He laughed. "You don't have to announce it." "I'm not announcing," I replied. "I'm telling you so there's no confusion." His smile dropped. "So you're punishing me now?" "No," I said. "I'm listening." He stood there for a long moment before scoffing. "You'll come around," he said. "You always do." That was the moment I realized he thought time was on his side. What he didn't know was that I had already started imagining a future where I didn't need permission to choose joy. And in that future, Daniel wasn't standing next to me anymore. The breakup didn't happen all at once. It happened quietly, in pieces, like furniture being removed from a room, one item at a time, until you suddenly realize the space is empty. After that Tuesday conversation, Daniel behaved as if nothing had changed. He sent me links to engagement rings again, Pinterest boards titled things like "Timeless Elegance," venues he thought would photograph well. He kept saying when. I kept answering with silence. About 2 months later, he suggested we take a break. Not a real break, the kind where you're expected to pause the relationship, reflect, and eventually come back improved. "I think some space will help you figure out what you want," he said one night, like he was assigning homework. I nodded. "You're right." That surprised him. I moved out the following weekend. Took my clothes, my books, the couch I had paid for. He watched me pack with the same amused patience he always had, completely confident this was temporary, that I would come back calmer, quieter, more willing to meet the expectations he had already designed. We stayed loosely in touch after that. Polite messages, occasional updates. Daniel continued posting his life online like nothing had happened. Trips, dinners, captions about standards and timing. Meanwhile, my life was quietly expanding. I focused on work first. The promotion had opened new opportunities, and I leaned into them. I traveled more for deals, built a stronger network, started saving aggressively, not for a ring, but for myself. I took trips I had always postponed. I made friends who didn't evaluate my worth by objects. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I stopped apologizing for being enough. About a year after the breakup, I ran into Marcus again. It happened on a random afternoon at a coffee shop near the office district. Same easy conversation as before, same curiosity, same sense that the air around him wasn't filled with expectations. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into weekends. There was no commentary about appearances, no comparisons, no pressure. When I eventually told him about my past relationship, he didn't flinch or try to analyze it. He just nodded. That must have been exhausting, he said. It was. A year after Daniel told me not to propose, I realized something quietly beautiful. I wanted to. Not because I was supposed to. Not to prove anything. Because this time it felt like an invitation, not a test. So I went back to that small jeweler. This time I didn't ask what I could afford. I asked what would last. The jeweler remembered me. That didn't take as long as I expected, he said with a smile. Neither did clarity, I replied. I chose a ring that didn't scream for attention. Clean lines, subtle weight, the kind of piece that wouldn't need explaining. When I finally set the budget, $10,000, it wasn't about flexing. It was about intention, and I knew exactly where I was going to propose. The same restaurant Daniel once told me was perfect for engagement photos. The one he said would make a proposal look impressive. He just never imagined who would be standing there. I didn't rush anything. That surprised me. With Daniel, everything had felt like a countdown, a race toward approval. With Marcus, there was no timer. Just momentum. The quiet kind that builds because nothing is being forced. When I finally slipped the ring into my pocket that night, I felt calm. Not nervous. Not anxious. Certain. The night of the proposal was simple. Marcus thought we were just going to dinner. The restaurant was exactly the way Daniel once described it. Outdoor seating, warm lighting, tables close enough that conversations blurred together. The kind of place where people celebrated things that mattered. We ordered drinks. Talked about work, about a trip we were planning, about nothing particularly dramatic. The air felt light, like the entire evening was unfolding naturally instead of being staged. At some point between the appetizers and the main course, I stood up. I didn't have a speech prepared. No memorized lines. Just a quiet certainty. When I pulled the ring from my pocket, Marcus blinked once, then twice, like his brain was trying to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. "Are you serious?" he asked. "Very." He didn't even let me finish the question. "Yes." The word came out before I finished the sentence. The table next to us started clapping first. Someone across the patio cheered. A server smiled as she passed by. Marcus laughed, half shocked, half thrilled, and pulled me into a hug. That's when I saw him. 3 tables away. Daniel. He was sitting with 2 friends, a glass of wine halfway to his mouth when his eyes landed on the ring in Marcus's hand. The color drained from his face almost immediately. For a second, he didn't move. Our eyes met across the patio for half a heartbeat. That was all it took. There was no smirk from me, no wave, no dramatic acknowledgement. I simply turned back to Marcus and kissed him, while the applause around us faded into laughter and conversation again. My phone buzzed before dessert even arrived. A message from a number I hadn't saved anymore. "Is that you?" I didn't respond. Marcus was still turning the ring under the light, laughing at nothing, asking me for the 5th time if this was real. Watching him felt grounding, like standing on solid ground after years of walking on sand. When we left the restaurant, I could feel eyes on my back. I didn't turn around. The next morning, the messages started. First, curiosity. "I didn't know you were seeing someone seriously." Then disbelief. "That ring looked expensive." Then confusion sharpening into something else. "I thought you said you weren't ready." That one almost made me laugh. By afternoon, the tone shifted again. "So that's it. After everything, you really did it there. Of all places." I still didn't reply. Later that night, Marcus noticed something was slightly different about me. Not distant, just quieter. "Old history?" he asked gently. I nodded. "Yeah, but it's finished." He didn't push for details. He just squeezed my hand. "I'm really glad you chose me." That sentence landed heavier than he probably realized. Because with Daniel, everything had always been conditional. With Marcus, it was mutual. The next day, Daniel called. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail instead. Long, measured, carefully controlled. He talked about timing, about growth, about how he never said no forever, about how he thought I understood the pressure he had been under. Pressure from whom was never clarified. Then he said something that finally made the whole situation make sense. "I didn't think you'd actually give that ring to someone else." There it was. He hadn't wanted me to propose later. He wanted me to wait indefinitely. Watching me choose someone else had shattered the illusion that he was the prize at the end of the road. For the first time since everything started, I didn't feel anger toward him. Just distance. The kind you feel when something no longer has access to you. And I knew the story still had one final moment left. Because Daniel wasn't finished trying to rewrite it. Daniel didn't wait long before trying a different tactic. 3 days after the proposal, he showed up at my office. Not storming in. Not crying. Composed. Polished. Dressed exactly the way he always dressed when he wanted to be taken seriously. Tailored coat. Perfect hair. Neutral expression that suggested everything was under control even when it wasn't. The receptionist called upstairs. "There's a Daniel Mercer here asking for you." I sighed quietly. "Send him to the lobby." When I walked downstairs, he was standing near the glass doors looking like he belonged there. Confident posture, hands in his pockets, the same careful calm he used during negotiations. When he saw me, he smiled. "Wow," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to my hand. "So it's real." "It is." He nodded slowly. "I just wanted to talk, not fight, not make a scene." We stepped outside. He crossed his arms in that familiar way. "I don't understand how you went from not ready to this." I kept my voice even. "I didn't go from not ready." He waited. "I went from not respected." His smile slipped. "So now I'm the villain." "No," I said calmly. "You're just not the partner." That landed harder than I expected. I could see it in the way his shoulders shifted slightly. "I never said I wouldn't have said yes," he said quickly. "I just wanted it done right." "I know," I replied. "And that's the problem." He scoffed. "So you spend $10,000 on a ring for someone who barely knows you?" I smiled slightly. "He knows me well enough not to measure me by it." That's when his voice cracked for the first time. "You did this to hurt me." "No," I said. "I did this because I was finally loved without conditions." He stared at me for a long moment. "You'll regret it." Maybe he believed that. But as I walked back inside, my phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. A picture of his hand holding mine across a cafe table, the ring catching sunlight perfectly. Under the picture, he had written one sentence. "Still can't believe you chose me." I didn't feel regret. I felt relief. Daniel stood outside on the sidewalk for another minute before finally turning and walking away. For a while, the story kept circulating through our mutual circles. Friends asking quiet questions. People trying to piece together what happened. Daniel apparently told people I had rushed into an engagement to prove a point. But the truth was simpler. I hadn't rushed. I had waited until I met someone who never made me feel small for wanting to offer love. A few months later, the noise faded. Marcus and I planned a small engagement dinner instead of a spectacle. Close friends, real laughter, no ranking or commentary about aesthetics. When someone complimented the ring, Marcus just smiled and said one thing. "She chose it." Like that was the entire story. And in many ways it was. Sometimes I think back to that night on the couch when Daniel laughed and told me not to propose. How certain he sounded. How convinced he was that timing and approval were things he controlled. He wasn't cruel loudly. He was cruel carefully. The kind that makes you doubt yourself while pretending it's for your own good. Here's what I learned. When someone tells you not to offer them love until it meets an external standard, believe them. They're not asking for patience. They're asking for power. And if you give it, they will keep moving the line. I didn't propose to Daniel because I was afraid of being mocked. I proposed later because I finally met someone who would have been happy with a ring pop if it came with sincerity. The irony isn't lost on me that Daniel saw the proposal he once wanted, just not with him. But that wasn't revenge. That was consequence. If you're in a relationship where your effort is constantly priced, ranked, or compared, pause. Ask yourself who benefits from you waiting. Ask yourself who decides when you are enough. Because sometimes the most satisfying ending isn't proving someone wrong. It's choosing someone who never made you feel wrong to begin with.